kind of a weird hour to do a live, but this is the time that I had for it today, so which is 12:30. So the following day, I guess. I don't expect anyone to actually be online necessarily, although I have people from all over the world, I suppose. Oh, here's somebody. And just because it's late here doesn't mean it's late somewhere else, of course. But I thought that I would do a video on my new IPM treatise, on the pests of cannabis and their management. Version 2.0. Big restructuring of the, and I have it right here, of what I had before, which was actually 1.2. So quite a bit has gone into this particular piece. All the way from Hawaii. This is a Hawaiian Isle Nursery. Hello. So this is about. So this is for cannabis crop. This is just talking about all the different organisms that infest or infect cannabis crops. There are. I want to preface this first by saying that this is certainly not. I'm not the first person to do something like this, but there have been other books, really great resources. Several of which I've sourced myself to try to get information, and they've been a great launching off point. Especially one by McPartland. He is he's probably the biggest cannabis researcher that I could think of, specifically with pests and pathogens and phytopathology and things like that. However, some of the since that book, which was like I want to say 10 or more years ago, some of the current research about some of the species, especially the fungi and the viruses, aren't necessarily accurate anymore, either because the nomenclature just doesn't exist or has been confirmed not to exist, or has been confused with some other virus perhaps, or because species get reclassified all the time. In fact, one good example of that here is under the fungal pests on the document. One of the organisms that I haven't actually made a section for, but it's coming soon, so I put that in there so people know what's coming through, and they can do their own research too, just on their own, in case they're like, oh, I've never heard of that, let me take a look at it. It's there for that reason. But here I have a Foma blight, which used to be Foma exigua, but now it's Boremia exigua. Exigua. So things like that, where species change, people don't necessarily know what's going on with that. Hawaiian Isle Nursery asks, I remember seeing a couple of your posts, but from what I understand after reading them, the hemp russet mite can't actually infest cannabis. Oh, yeah, it can. I don't know what you necessarily mean by infest. I know some people think that it can, bore into, seed or something like that. I've heard that story from people before, and I'm pretty sure that's not the case. But certainly, overwintering females and dudagines could be possibly found in, seed, for example. But not, I don't really quite understand. It can hemp russet mite, Aculops cannabicola, can definitely infest cannabis crops. Definitely. TYC says, my boss's farm got destroyed by russets this year. Yeah, definitely something that can cause crop failure. Certainly, I've seen it before, or at least something close to it, close enough that the yield was greatly affected. So, anyways, I just want to talk about this document a little bit, partly because people have been supporting it so much recently, which I really, really appreciate. I have lost focus. That's unfortunate. Oh well. So yeah, so not only have people been supporting me with this, which I really appreciate right now, um, but I also thought it would be helpful for people to understand what exactly it is, and go into some detail. Um, so what it is essentially is it is a regularly updating collection of mostly academic literature backed sections on various pests and pathogens of cannabis. So some of them are so for example, I have it structured. I'll put it this way: I have it structured mainly with a few large groups, large taxonomic groups. So first we have the arthropods, so that's mites and insects and organisms like that. Um, hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying not to be super technical. So you've got like your spider mites, your russet mites, your moths and butterflies and their larvae, beetles, for example, flies, grasshoppers, crickets, thrips, spittlebugs, leafhoppers, aphids, whiteflies, scale insects, both armored and soft-scaled. Um, yeah, so that's all in the arthropod section, right? Um, and then I have nematodes, fungal pests, bacterial pests, and viral pests. Oh, and then botanical pests. There are plant pests of cannabis too. So those are like the major taxonomic groups, and then people can just kind of like Control F whatever thing they're looking for or something like that. And pretty much all of these, except for in the case of a couple where I only personally have I have an anecdotal evidence. I have like photographs or personal photos that sort of show off the fact that an organism that hasn't been recorded yet is on it, because it could just be like a nuisance pest. It might not be like a huge big problem pest, but it might be an organism that somebody sees innocuously feeding on their plant and not know what it is, if that makes sense. So not necessarily a pest, but more like a host, or an herbivore that can use cannabis as a host. Hawaiian Nursery says, I guess I might be getting it wrong. It was a post about some type of myth that a lot of growers are diagnosing their plant pest issues wrong. Yeah, talk about the article. No, it's no problem. I definitely talked about some cannabis myths semi-recently. And the big one was that people thought that tomato russet mite, Aculops lycopersicii, could infest, or rather, Aculops cannabicola could infest tomatoes and hemp, or Aculops lycopersicii could infest both tomatoes, which is its only host, and I guess a couple of other solanaceous crops technically, but most russet mites are species specific, so you won't find them on different species of hosts, except for in very rare cases. And Aculops cannabicola is very closely related. It's in the same genus as Aculops lycopersicii, which is kind of interesting when you consider the fact that like solanaceous crops developed really far away from cannabis, as I understand it, paleobotanically. So it is kind of interesting that two mites of like basically the same genus, that are the same genus, are like specialized on such divergent plants. It's sort of odd. So will all this info be in like a one-drop file book that all of us could take a look through? It's actually for purchase, but the reason for that is because it takes me so long to accrue all this information, and it's meant to be sort of like an ongoing thing. On my Patreon, so here's how it works. There's basically on my Patreon, people who support at the $50 level will be able to get regularly updating versions of this treatise. But other people can also just buy the most current version for the same amount of money one time. And that's kind of what I've been doing, and people have been really appreciating the content lately. And I did just make this big change to the document as it's been. So a lot of this information also, some of these sections on certain pests, some of that information exists on my YouTube channel for free. So if you want to check that out, you can also do that. The way that I like to sort of do things, I like to make most of the content that I can that's informational for free, so that people can better themselves. But when I do certain projects like this, I do have to justify the time. It is quite a big time commitment to make this sort of like meta reference. But I do want to make sure that people have it for a pretty reasonable price, and also having the option to like subscribe to a constantly evolving one is also helpful for a lot of people, because I pretty much update this monthly, and as I'm going back through the contents, I have several pests and pathogens that are coming soon, so there's quite a bit of information coming in, and it's helpful to get all of this recent information, because like for some pests, Tetronychus urticae, for example, the two-spot spider mite, it's been around for a long time, so there's a lot of research on it, and a lot of old references like books and things. Those are static. They don't evolve with the new information that's coming out monthly, quarterly, yearly. So that's kind of the advantage of this. Hopefully, this system. So far, it's been working out for a lot of people, and I'm glad that people are finding value in it. However, other pests that are very new, that's the other problem, is that a static reference wouldn't have access to those as well. And it wouldn't, by definition, a static book can't change. And so it also doesn't have the advantage that this document has and this program has. And I think that in cannabis in particular, new pests and pathogens are coming out all the time, and university references are coming out all the time, which is also really helpful. But not everywhere is it supported, and so I'm hoping that this can be a good support in the interim, until like the government kind of gets its act together, I suppose. I know a lot of agriculturalists and a lot of university professors in like the Department of Agriculture, in agricultural departments rather, who would love to be more open about their support, but they just can't, and it's sort of like this weird gray area where they can't really help, even though they probably could, because there is like old pest and pathogen information from like the 1950s and even prior to that. But all of that stuff is outdated, quite outdated, and some of it's not even true anymore. So, do you have Patreon? Is it linked? Yeah, it's Zenthanol, same name as my YouTube channel, and this video is going to go on to my YouTube channel as well. So, if you want to interact and engage there, you can as well. I like to make sure that my YouTube channel, my Patreon. So basically, my Patreon helps support a lot of the free content that I make. Anyways, I'll always be making the free content, but that sort of support does allow for me to like upgrade my software. It allows me also to get access to certain academic reports. I like to make videos for different pests. My Pest Primer series has a lot of information on different species, both pests and pathogens of all kinds of plants, but many of those are also pests of cannabis, because they are generalists and they eat like 1,200 different kinds of plants, like in the case of the two-spotted spider mite. But then there are also other pests that are a little bit more specialist, like the piriform heart scale I did like a month ago. But I have like videos on like fungus gnats and western flower thrips, lettuce powdery mildew, which is also the powdery mildew that one of the powdery mildews that infects Cananbis, Golovinomyces cicoracearum. So yeah, if you are interested in taking a look at what some of the rewards are for my Patreon, you certainly don't have to be at this $50 level to be supportive either. If all you can do is a single dollar, I have no problem with that. I try not to be preachy about this sort of a thing too. Like, it's a thing that exists, and I don't feel owed ever necessarily, because I'm going to be making this information because I'm passionate about it no matter what. But the people who do see that and are able to kind of help me along a little bit financially, I do want to do something special for those people who can do that. So that's kind of the main impetus for the Patreon account. And it's allowed me to make projects like this a whole lot easier over the span of like the last year or two-ish. Yeah, Maple Falls says you need to eat too, though. No, absolutely, and I have my own professional work in the agriculture industry, including working with cannabis and going to presentations or giving presentations and doing things like that. So I definitely, it's more of a justification for me to use like what little free time I have to also do extra work, kind of, as well, I suppose. You could kind of look at it like that. But yeah, projects like these take a ton of time. I think I was posting about it a little while ago on my story, and I was saying that what was it? The average. I was crunching the numbers, and it takes me like many hours, multiple hours, like 6 hours per organism. No, it wasn't 6 hours. It was 6 times. Yeah, it was like 18 hours. Like, oh no, it was 120 pages. I'm sorry. It was 18 hours, and like usually the average like paper amount is like 100. How many page amount is like 120 per organism. But for something like Tetronychus urticae, to accrue all of the relevant data that I want to put in, and I do have to cut some of that information, so some of that extra information that's kind of ancillary but cool and interesting, like the Tetronychus urticae genome, which is really resistant to plant defense compounds. Not necessarily needed in a sort of like pest and pathogen guide, but it is something that I know and I come across when I'm trying to get all this relevant information for the organism, and then I write the section for it, and then I show the literature that's referenced, which not everything is academic. Pretty much like 90% of these have multiple academic resources that back up what I'm saying, but sometimes I also draw from non-academic sources too, mostly for like examples of things that are sort of ancillary to what I'm already talking about. But anyways, let's see here. Hawaiian Isle Nursery says, that's right. A lot of the new and current pest or virus articles that are published online actually cost a lot. Yeah, they really do. Some of them are pretty egregious. It's just that's not great. And I do have academic contacts that do allow me to get access to a lot of free research. So that's kind of nice. But not all of it is accessible either. So that does pose a challenge. And I know some people do like to use Sci-Hub and things like that, and certainly have in the past. But like, it doesn't. I don't know. I definitely support the free share of knowledge. I think that like something like that is a net good, but at the same time, sometimes even Sci-Hub isn't able to get an article, especially like things. Sometimes things don't have a DOI either. So it just doesn't work out, or an ISSN. Yeah, I appreciate it. If you like my drive and if you want to support me, TYC, I really appreciate that. But again, it's like not something I ever feel owed, and I don't want anyone to ever get the impression that I'm pressuring anyone or that I'm like, I don't know. I just don't like the the hype, I suppose. If you like what I do, and especially particularly if something that I've done has been helpful to you, I would appreciate it. But it's supposed to help everyone, and not everyone is in a position where they can give money, any kind of money. And you know, I've also been in that situation a lot too, so I totally empathize. You shouldn't have to explain the reasons why it's not free, bro. Anyone with common sense should be able to understand why it's not free. No, I don't think any. Oh, I don't get the. I don't know if you like. I don't. Yeah, I suppose, but I just think that it's helpful to give a little bit of context from where at least where my perspective is. How many different organisms, viruses are currently in your article? Good question. I didn't actually write this down. I probably should have, but let me count for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Oh, but these are also the coming soon ones, aren't they? So they're not actually in there yet. Hold on. Let me recount. The ones that are actually in right now that have sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 21. But I have, 22. 22. Sorry. Yeah, it looks like 22. But I have like about half again as many coming soon. So that's going to expand quite a bit in the next few months. And I try to add like as many as I can. Usually I can get like 2 to 3 sections out per month so far. And I think that's a pretty nice clip. If I get a pest organism that's particularly that has a lot of information associated with it that's going to be useful, then it will take exorbitantly more time. If it's an organism that like we know it's an herbivore, I mean we know it's a folivore of cannabis, for example, but like you know it's kind of an innocuous pest, then there's a lot less information possibly, and the section's going to be a lot smaller perhaps. I also when I can, I like to get enough. I like to get pictures. Several of the pictures in the document are taken by me of the pest. Mostly things that aren't captioned that have references to the people who have taken the pictures under Creative Commons where it's possible. But yeah, I definitely, or people that I know, for example, who have said that it's okay to utilize the photographs. But yeah, hold on. I'm definitely not paying attention to the comments. There aren't any many big ones. All right, cool. So yeah, anyone who's coming in right now, basically, this is me talking about the new 2.0 on the pests of cannabis and their management document. I wanted to kind of talk about the document as a whole. People who have been asking what exactly it is. Some people have been supporting it, and I just send them out to the people who have been supporting it both on Patreon and who just recently bought it because they were interested. Basically, we have I've structured it such that pest organisms are under like a family or an order. So, like for example, fungus gnats are flies, so they are under the flies or the dipterans category. Or lettuce powdery mildew, which is also a powdery mildew that infects cannabis. It's Golovinomyces siceracerum. It's under the powdery mildew section, or the erysipelas. So, and then there's sections for arthropods, so that's like insects and mites and things like that. So that's like aphids, whiteflies, thrips, for example. I'm going to have to put some other stuff in there, scale insects. And then there's also nematodes, fungal organisms, bacterial or pests, and viruses. And also botanical pests too. For example, dodder, which is a plant parasite. I thought it would be a lot more, okay, so most of these pests or viruses are somehow related to cannabis or are commonly found in home gardens or farms. Is that how you're picking which ones? Well, no, actually, most of the pests of cannabis are not specific to cannabis. Most of cannabis pests are not specialists. They're actually generalists, like the two-spot spider mite or the western flower thrips. But no, they are related to cannabis. They are cannabis pests. Several are really big problems, like lettuce powdery mildew, and also 2 other powdery mildews. But I have them here. Onion powdery mildew and hops powdery mildew all infest cannabis, for example. Fungus gnats do spread fusarium. That's correct. They do vector it. I think I even pointed that out in my pest primer video on YouTube for fungus gnats. At least dark-winged fungus gnats, Bradisia species. For example, there's also the Cannabis cryptic virus. There's an entry on that. I really wanted to make sure that there was a reference for that organism because the Cannabis cryptic virus is very new. There's only like a couple of articles online that I was able to find on it. And apparently it also infests hops, which is kind of interesting, especially since it doesn't seem like infested or infected hops plants or cannabis plants can like physically touch with each other and pass it on. So they are but it's actually found to be instead of being horizontally transmitted like that, it's vertically transmitted from parent to offspring through seed. Several viruses are like this. Actually, dozens of viruses are like that, actually. But anyways, Cannabis cryptic virus appears to be such a virus. And they also make note that it's very likely that hemp cultivars in general probably all have the virus because it's cryptic, meaning that it's very hard to pick up. If you're not looking for it, you won't necessarily find it. They only found it because they were actually trying to work with, I want to say hops latent virus or something like that. And then they found this like weird, like, I guess you could say some, what's the word, some sort of weird extraneous thing that they focused on. They found this whole new organism. Well, virus anyways. But yeah, there's Cannabis cryptic virus, and there's also hemp phytoplasmas. So phytoplasmas are also kind of like cryptic viruses in that they are very hard to study. They aren't always super overt, like they don't always have symptoms that are obvious, but they can cause plants to grow in a really odd way. Sometimes it's called witch's broom. So the group 16SR7 phytoplasmas is the, I guess you could say, is the like group of phytoplasmas that that infect cannabis and hemp. So those two, so I specifically mentioned those two organisms partly because there's not a whole lot of information on them in general, and they're definitely not in any other reference for them. They're definitely not any big reference that I've come across myself. So I thought it was really important that I put some sort of information out there that's mostly unique and new so that people can get an added value from that. because it's the new pests and pathogens that are just being discovered because modern technology has improved, or awareness has improved because people are cultivating a little bit more openly and people are able to talk about it a little bit more and things like that. Because of that, more research is happening little by little. One interesting bit of research that I came across actually was that and I don't have a reference for this, unfortunately, off the top of my head. I'm just speaking. But I thought that I read that the cannabis aphid perhaps evolved from the hops aphid. Like, they're directly related, but like basically the hops aphid kind of had an offshoot and sort of specialized on cannabis, which would not be the first time something like that ever happened, ecologically and evolutionarily speaking. So certainly it's not outside the realm of possibility. It is plausible. So little tidbits of information like that, sometimes I like to add in there as well, because it can help somebody kind of visualize and understand, like, exactly what their like opponent is, exactly what these pests are and what they're capable of. Earlier I mentioned that Tetranychus urticae, the two-spotted spider mite, it has a genome that is quite devoted to filtering out what are called xenobiotics, or like plant defense compounds. Pesticides, for example, fall under this, and it's part of the reason why it's such a super generalist. It's able to, like, sequester or process, kind of like with like you can think of it like a super liver. Like, it can just process various toxins and poisons and things that would otherwise hurt the organism, which is pretty incredible. But like, organisms that have that ability, like Western flower thrips is pretty similar. They also tend to be really good at getting quickly resistant to different chemical pesticides anyways. So if you understand that an organism is a super generalist that you're dealing with, these spider mites, then you know that that spider might be on any number of plants that are on your property. And if that's the case, and if you anticipate that you're going to have spider mites, you might want to try to cull plants that are not necessary. Otherwise, you might have a big problem on your hands, where you might be treating your cultivation space, but if you totally ignore the rest of your property and it has a lot of plants on it, that can be a problem. So knowing things like that can be helpful. Most people aren't using chemical pesticides. I mean, there are natural chemistries, botanical, insecticidal chemical agents and things like that, and horticultural oils and things. But I definitely like to see the use of biocontrol agents as well. And in each section there are examples of like biocontrol agents that are used against various pests. Not every pest and not every pathogen has this information, unfortunately, especially for the things that are very new, like the globe mallow beetle. Not a whole lot of information on what attacks it, because it's not really a huge problem in general, even though it is a leaf beetle. So it helps the two-spotted spider mite basically adapt and evolve, right? Yeah, exactly. The being able to cancel out and negate and neutralize different defense compounds in plants allows it to hyper-generalize and then possibly even specialize. You could get speciation that way as well. I've heard of spider mites. Would that be the type of spider mite I've heard can destroy a whole crop, or are there a few spider mites that can? I think getting total crop failure from spider mites is pretty rare. Even in other crops, even other agricultural crops, but they do reproduce quite a bit, and they can really affect yield, and they can really, like, if they're not dealt with, if they're not scouted for on a regular basis, and it's like really hot, then Yeah, I could see them blowing up out of proportion. And somebody who might not know how to deal with them who might get quite upset or afraid that things are going to get really bad, when not necessarily is that the case. Which is how it builds a tolerance to some of the pesticides we use. Exactly right. The same physiological mechanisms that allow it to neutralize defense compounds in plants are the same mechanisms that are allowing it to be resistant to pesticides, or at least or already evolve those differences, and then the ones that are affected, well, they die, of course, but yes, it is essentially the case. I've heard spider mites are the worst, but I work with a few old heads when it comes to pot. Yeah, well, russet mites, I would say, are probably more of a crop killer than spider mites. Actually, most russet mites that we know of are not a problem. Most russet mites, there are like over 5,000 species that we know of, and there are probably quite a bit more, are specialists, but they don't cause really very much physiological damage to their host at all. And it's really hard to like account for them, to be honest. Most people, like most acarologists, which study mites, they don't really look at russet mites that much. But there are a few russet mites that do cause incredible damage to their host, and when they happen to be a human crop, then they are a huge pest. The aloe mite is one good example. Obviously, the hemp russet mite is a good example for people who grow cannabis. The tomato russet mite can be a big problem as well. What would you consider the most destructive mite? Yeah, probably russet mites. Yeah, even more than... No, I take that back. Of all time, probably broad mites, because they are not specialists. So they attack many more, like over 200 different crop species, and probably quite a bit more that aren't crops. And they have very similar terrible damage to russet mites. So I would say the winner there would be broad mites. But russet mites and cannabis in particular are very noxious. Yeah, we had russet mites this year. It was terrible. I bet it was terrible. The workers decided they didn't like to spray during budding, and they ate damn near a whole crop. Yeah, I mean, like, that's what happens sometimes too. Like, recently, for example, in oilseed crops, where the stem flea beetle, I think, has become a real big problem. So in Europe, they banned neonicotinoids for use against this pest, and that was basically the farmer's only resort to killing the organism. And crops are kind of failing from it. I'm not saying that it wasn't the correct choice or anything like that, but sometimes there isn't a control for a pest for a little while, and like that's a reality of life, and that like that's one of the reasons why farm life can be very, very difficult sometimes. And there's even less pests out there that have really effective biocontrol agents, especially things that you can use at a high scale, like in grain, for example. Would you happen to know how using crushed aspirin in a foliage affects them? How does it negate this physiological process that happens to stop it from building a tolerance? Well, I don't know. Are you saying that you've used aspirin? I think I've heard a story about that before. But I've never heard of that. I mean, I've heard of that, but I haven't used that, and I don't have an explanation necessarily. I suppose, like, even a really comprehensive and sophisticated genome, like, isn't perfect, so perhaps it's just not working out for the aspirin. Um, yeah. I think russet or broad mites are the devils. The two-spot spider mites are the easiest to get rid of and under control. Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. I would definitely agree with that. Um, do broad mites stick around like russets? Uh, you mean like, I guess under what context do you mean that? Because like they can overwinter, if that's what you mean. Um, and I mean, they can especially hang around on many different alternative hosts. So that's one way that they would actually be superior, in which case I would mean more formidable as a pest, because russet mites are specialists. They're only going to be coming from hemp russet mites are only going to be coming from other cannabis crops. But broad mites can be coming from corn, they even coming from strawberries, gerbera, all kinds of different plants. So if you live in an agricultural area, you will probably have much more likely of a chance to come across these super generalists like Tetronychus urticae or Polyphagotarsinemus latus, the broad mite. Can't russets stick around for like 5 years or something? Oh, you mean like overwintering, I guess. They're not like tardigrades or anything like that. But they can overwinter. In fact, russet mites have a special adult female form called a deutogyne, and a deutogyne. Deutogynes of different species look more like themselves and like their male partners, which is kind of odd. However, they are the only overwintering form that's a true overwintering form. It's very great questions. It's not ignorant at all. It's just I was just explaining. It's on mostly every single gardening website I've been to online. They all advise to put in a foliar with just water and crushed aspirin into the IPM schedule. I think I've heard that before, but I don't know why. I do know that like in some experimental cases, tetracycline, which is an antibiotic, an antibacterial, antibacterial or antifungal? No, now I'm forgetting. Is it? Let me check. 1 second. Yeah, it is an antibiotic. Anyways, they were able to use tetracycline to flush out a bacterial infection in a plant because it was systemic, which I thought was kind of interesting. The main farm I work at is in the middle of a cornfield, so that would make sense. Yeah, absolutely, right? So there are other pests that attack corn, some of which that I'm going to be talking about in my document in the treatise. But one example is the corn borer, which probably makes sense, right? Which I have here as the Ostrinia nubialis. Nubialis. That's the corn borer. And I find that that larvae that burrow into the inflorescence of the cannabis plant, those are the worst. Those are the worst in other crops too, like flower crops. Like you can't sell a flower after it's been munched on, after the petals are destroyed. Even a little bit of damage in the right place will totally destroy like the marketability of like cosmetic crops. It's really insane. It's really terrible. But the same thing for cannabis, right? So what else were you going to talk about for your article before you realized that people were actually up and online? Good question. Well, mainly I just wanted to talk about the fact that it's around, that I wanted to answer other people's questions about it too, but I appreciate you asking. Keeping me on track, I really appreciate that. I just want to talk about some of the species that are in there. I wanted to talk about the process a little bit. I wanted to talk about how people have been supporting me already and that I really, really appreciate it that people have been. And I also appreciate that people have been finding it quite helpful. I wouldn't put it out there if I didn't think that people would find benefit from it. And I also wanted to talk about how There are a lot of great resources where where you can get this sort of information if you're on a tighter budget and you aren't able to support in that way. That's totally cool. I'll also always be making always be making free content as well on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol. And several of the organisms in this document are also already pest primer videos, and those are totally free. And there's academic literature that backs those up too, that are referenced in the description. So people can definitely get a lot of this information for free. It's just they have to do a little bit more legwork to get it. Whereas here, it's all collected too, and a little bit more updated than some of my older videos. I'll have to make newer videos to kind of replace them, since the research that's coming out on particularly terrible pests is getting more and more every day. And I also go over pests that aren't just cannabis pests as well. But many cannabis pests are also pests of other organisms. They're generalists. So yeah, is that all my comments? Yeah, cool. Let's see, what's another good one? Yeah, know thy enemy, says Maple Falls. Yeah, it's like if you know your pest and you know its behaviors, you know its physiology a little bit. Not a whole lot. You don't have to like get a PhD in spider mites, right? But like it could be helpful for some people who find it interesting, like myself, I suppose. Like I have a video where I talk about how spider mites like their visual range, like what's like the color spectrum range for spider mite eyes, and apparently like a really lime green color of a particular nanometer wavelength makes them want to go there. Like, they see that green color and they go, I want to walk towards it. And then they see this red color and they're like, I'm going to walk away from it. And then they see this like almost ultraviolet color, and I think they're also attracted to that, or makes them move around or something. Anyways, that kind of stuff is kind of cool, and I also have videos on that, but I have to cut some of that information out, but sometimes I add it into the sections here because it could be useful for somebody who's trying to use a special kind of trap, for example. If they wanted to like make something up themselves, perhaps having that information could be very beneficial. And it's the kind of thing that you don't really necessarily think to look at if you're not like a big bug nerd like me, who spends his time learning about spider mite eyes and things like that. How many people do you know? Like even entomologists, like that's not. I feel like that's not very common. So are you also adding in your own personal experience of trying to get rid of some of these pests? Sort of. I definitely write I'm definitely writing from my own experience, but I do try to keep most of the information sort of related to things like life tables, things like how many offspring an adult can make, and sort of like, I guess, like quantifiable things that are referenced in the literature. It's a lot less of like my own like personality necessarily. Like my writing style is there, right? But I'm not necessarily trying to be like writing from the first person necessarily. I don't go like, well, when I had this problem, I did this. It's more, I try to keep most of the information, which a lot of my experiences have, been similar to the academic literature, for example. There are even some pests here that I've really become very, very, very familiar with, and yeah, like others not as much necessarily. So there are stains that attract certain mites. There are colors, certainly. There are definitely colors. Yeah, I know. And also, like, well, it's certain predatory mites and pests, for example, like so some tomato cultivars are pubescent. They're very hairy. There's a lot of like trichome hairs all over the stem and all over the leaves and things like that. And then there are some tomato cultivars that are what's called glabrous. They're very smooth, much less of this sort of trichomal structure. And guess what? Spider mites and predatory mites do poorly on the more pubescent plants with more trichomes. Now, these trichomes aren't necessarily glandular. They might be striate, I think is the phrase, if I'm saying it right. Basically, they're hairs. They're more like hairs than like glands or anything like that. But they still seem to interact negatively with a lot of arthropod organisms. And then if you've ever seen like tobacco leaves, for example, a lot of tobacco leaves are very, very sticky and trichomous, and like you'll have gnats flying, and they'll sit on that leaf and they'll just die there because they just can't get lift off afterwards because the glands have like stuck them together like glue. So putting certain colors around the infested areas could be used as a form of pest management. That's crazy. I didn't know they were affected by color spectrum. Well, yeah, not necessarily by doing that, but like, for example, I think it was the pea aphid. That it has this really interesting quirk about its eyes that allows it to like sense, or at least like tell if certain bacteria are that could be pathogenic to it are in this area, and it could like just move away from them, which I thought was really fascinating. Not something you can necessarily make a lot of make very much with that information, but it is kind of cool and it is helpful to know. But what you could do with the color stuff is, like, for example, if you knew that the organism commits to phototaxy at a certain color spectrum, you might be able to use certain lights, for example. Maybe you'll be able to like attract them that way. Things like that might be possible, but without having that information, nobody would ever think to experiment. I don't necessarily know if that's possible for spider mites in particular, but I do know that there are different colored like sticky traps that are like yellow and blue and things like that, and I think there are blue ones that are supposed to be more attractive to certain species of thrips, like western flower thrips, for example. Yeah. I just thought it might have been good for some of us to read so we could know which forms of management are most likely to work or not. Yeah, no, like that's I try to bring up multiple like management techniques that are possible, including biocontrol agents, but also like you might be able to fashion, who knows, like you might be able to fashion some sort of a trap that's attractive to spider mites. And if you if you make like a little green lantern that's the right nanometers, and if you want to check what that is on my YouTube channel, you can look up Tetronychus urticae. Actually, why don't I just do that instead of talking about it? Because I know that I'm like quoting myself perhaps wrong, and I don't want to do that. So let me just reference my own video on live. Yeah, I think this is it. Right, okay. Yeah, Tetronychus urticae has two pairs. So the title is Tetronychus urticae, Physiology and General Knowledge. Tetronychus urticae has two pairs of eyes which are very small and primitive. Unable to resolve images, they convey little more than the detection of certain wavelengths of light. Phototaxis is observed at 375 nanometers, and photokinesis is at 525, with repellency documented at 700. Okay, right. Okay. So phototaxis is going towards it, Repellency is obviously going away from it, and photokinesis is just kind of moving based on the light. So they're repelled by red color, 700 nanometers. They are attracted to 375 nanometers, which is like kind of a violet color, very close to that. And then a very lime green color will kind of stimulate them to move around. So that's kind of interesting, right? Yeah, so that kind of information could be helpful if somebody made like a lantern, maybe, who knows. And maybe they made it that special like 375 nanometer color, perhaps maybe like coating it in some sort of like natural mitocidal agent. Maybe basically you could just attract a bunch of spider mites to that light and they would just perish as they tried to climb onto it. That might be something people could do. That sort of creative, out-of-the-box thinking, a lot of farmers just kind of have to have, because like there are a ton of regulations, and rightly so. You know, you don't want people to be using literal poisons incorrectly, even if they're like, you know, naturally derived or something like that. Which reminds me, that's a thing to consider, right? Like if people are utilizing more and more botanical insecticides, botanical pesticides, like terpene-based pesticides that are coming out and things like that. I wonder if we'd run the risk of resistance with those too. And if we do, is it possible that the pests that might become resistant due to improper exposure, are they now going to be super pests from the plants because even the plant's innate defense compounds are suddenly way less effective? Something to think about. Another thing that that's important to consider for Tetranicus urticae actually is that for a long time people thought that there was another mite called the carmine mite, Tetranicus cinnaberinus, that was like a sister species or something. They're actually the same species as Tetranicus urticae. They are the same organism. They're just a red form of it. And for a long time, that was a big dispute for like almost 100 years. Isn't that crazy? But like now we live in a time where it's really easy to, you know, just PCR that or like get them to mate or like observe all kinds of things. It's just kind of a neat time that we are in agriculture and technology. That are possible? What that are supposed to work from previous attempts and I don't understand your question. Maybe you or some of us should do specific IPM methods on some of the most ran into pests. Yeah, I don't understand what the first part of your paragraph here is. Probably because you started off it with like a response to something that I have no idea what it was exactly, since I'm constantly speaking. Yeah, so feel free to clarify that statement. If I interpret it right, if you're talking about like the management procedures, then yeah, in my case, like I usually consult academic literature, usually because that's just what I do and what I have access to and how I've been taught. But you know, it tends to pan out. It tends to work out. Not always, though, but it tends to do so. That info is what would separate your article from all the others, in my opinion. It won't just be theories. Oh, okay. It'll be information based on first-hand experiments. Oh, right. I see what you're saying, but like academic literature isn't just like theoretical experiments. A lot of times they're case studies or they're field studies, and things like that, where they actually test efficacy and stuff like that. And you know, the academic literature isn't necessarily biocontrol agent Amblysia swerskii against broad mite. Does it work? It's also things like, you know, where did it come from? What's its native range? academic literature that goes over aspects of the physiology and other sorts of things like that.